Hello everyone, glad to have you back. Today I want to talk about the F-Zero timelines. And yes, if you didn't know, there are two different ones. What are the two timelines anyway? Well, first you have what most consider to be the Canon timeline. It features the most detailed story, the most games, and is generally pretty consistent with events and characters. The games in this timeline includes F-Zero, F-Zero X, F-Zero Maximum Velocity, F-Zero GX, and technically F-Zero AX. The second timeline, or the alternate universe, if you want to call it that, is the anime timeline. As the name reveals, this timeline is based around the F-Zero anime and the two games based off of it, Cheaper Legend and Climax. It has its own story, and while most characters are kinda the same, a few key ones are a lot different from their original versions, and the entire story is very different. Let's first begin with the original or main timeline. In the 24th century, about 200 years before the events of F-Zero, there existed a predecessor to F-Zero called F-Max. We know that because one racer from the F-Max Grand Prix still competes in F-Zero to this day, the Skull. Judging by the name, it's a successor to F1 racing, but other than that, we don't really know anything about F-Max. It's only mentioned in the Skull's description in-game or in the manuals of X and GX. Then there is quite a big gap. There isn't any confirmed information that I could find, so between F-Max and the creation of F-Zero is a span of about 200 years where nothing major really happens. Anyway, either in 2560 or in the 2560s, depending on which manual you want to trust, F-Zero was created. By who? Rich space merchants who were basically bored and they searched for a way to entertain themselves and obviously to make more money. They were inspired by F-Max and F1, so they decided to create F-Zero as we know it today. It's not known 100% if the Grand Prix scene in F-Zero and its comic is the first one to ever happen. There are implications that there was one before that, but we don't really know. The comic, which is called The Story of Captain Falcon by the way, plays a short time before F-Zero. It's really short and shows Captain Falcon as a bounty hunter, and it ends with the start of the first race on Mute City, which leads directly into the game, and that's pretty much the first GP that we get to see. Unlike other games, it isn't known who won the GP. It's most likely Falcon, because why wouldn't he? But no confirmed information. BS F-Zero Grand Prix 1 and 2 would be right after that, but those games are already obscure enough and they don't have any lore that I could find. It's not even confirmed if the 4 machines in the game belong to the 4 original pilots. There may be a chance they do, but it's all a bit weird, so let's just continue. Sometime after that, but before F-Zero X, a horrible accident happened. You may have heard me talk about that one in one of my shorts, which you should really check out if you haven't already. Anyway, an accident happened which led to the suspension of any further F-Zero races. Even though there were no casualties, it still left a mark on some racers, like Mighty Gazelle. He was a human before that, but he suffered the most from the accident and ended up as a cyborg. Thanks to the help of Dr. Stewart, it was possible to save all the racers from death, but many were still hospitalized, like Captain Falcon. That led to the creation of Blood Falcon as well. Black Shadow managed to get a hold of Falcon's DNA, and with that he created that evil clone. He also stole a part of the Blue Falcon, which maybe explains why the Blue Falcon's design changed so much after F-Zero. Pico is generally considered to be the main suspect of the accident. He is generally known to be a very aggressive racer after all. 3 years after the accident, F-Zero racing finally continued with F-Zero X. Many new racers entered the GP as well. Despite it adding so much to the F-Zero universe in terms of characters, there really isn't any lore. We only have the manuals, which don't tell us that much, and the Lost webcomic, but you've already heard me talk about that one multiple times now, and it's most likely not even canon. All we really know is that Captain Falcon won the F-Zero X GP. Like BS F-Zero Grand Prix 1 and 2, the X expansion kit is so obscure and irrelevant to lore that it doesn't matter at all. I get it from a real-world perspective to add something to the game, but in-universe it seems a bit odd. I personally see them as kinda competitive, but not Grand Prix level races. Let me know what you think about that idea. 1 year after the XGP, we get to F-Zero GX, which adds a lot of lore, to be honest. Before we even get into the Grand Prix itself, we have story mode to consider. It technically plays before the Grand Prix, or at least before the finale. It's not really clear, at least to me. Anyway, story mode. I will not describe every single chapter for you. You will probably play them all anyway, and they aren't that complex, so I'll be quick to not make this video too long. Deathborn, champion of the Underworld Grand Prix, is introduced. He seems to be the boss of Black Shadow, or at least Black Shadow is scared of him. We get this cutscene, we've all seen it, that leads into the main event of story mode, which is basically Black Shadow causing chaos in or on Lightning. Watch this video if you want to know more about locations and stuff, by the way. Falcon trains, is on his way to Lightning, has an encounter with Samurai Goro, secretly enters a race for Silver Nielsen, fights off the bloody Chain Gang and finally reaches Lightning. He saves Jody from the power plant, which was rigged to explode by none other than Black Shadow, which he meets soon after. We're at chapter 6 with the bomb. Falcon gets it off and manages to enter the F-Zero Grand Prix. I do not know if the Grand Prix mode plays before, or during, or after story mode. If I had to guess, it all plays before, and chapter 7 is the grand finale. Theories aside, Falcon wins, obviously, and he meets Deathworm. Blah blah, higher forces, underworld things. Falcon beats him as well while racing in the underworld. That leads to the combination of the 2 champion belts, and that now seems to anger God himself, since the creator reveals himself to Falcon, tells him about the universe, and then he challenges him to a race, which of course Falcon wins. Because he's just that good. That's the story right there, but it has one big, giant, unavoidable problem that we have to consider now, which is Black Shadow. His pilot movie to be exact. Why? Well, take a look. That sure is interesting. Does that now confirm the story mode is just a movie? It's possible. That entirely depends on if you consider the pilot movies to be canon. Most are humorous and are just there for a quick laugh or to add a little bit of character to all the races and not more. I think this is entirely up to you. AX would be next, and who would have thought it doesn't have any lore. We have the 10 new racers and a few tracks, but with the exception of one, which I will talk about in a moment, we don't have any new additions to lore. A shame, but it's just an arcade game. Doubt much thought went into it. The next big event in the timeline is Maximum Velocity, which is the last game in the main timeline. The game itself says that it takes place 25 years after Captain Falcon and Dr. Zero piloted their way to fame. It isn't 100% clear if this means 25 years after F-Zero on the SNES or 25 years after GX and AX. But since Maximum Velocity was released 2 years before GX, I think it's 25 years after the SNES game. I could make an entire video talking about some inconsistencies with machine performance and designs, but let's just accept it's even more in the future, okay? We know that sometime before Maximum Velocity, Bianca City slowly started to replace Mute City as the economic center of the galaxy. Captain Falcon, Dr. Stewart, and probably everyone else we know has retired. None of them are present in Maximum Velocity. Many new locations are also introduced, and almost every old one is missing from the game. We don't know why though. And now there's yet another gap, but this time it is quite a bit longer. The timeline skips to the 29th century. We know that F-Zero still exists, but in a different form. That's revealed by Phoenix in his interviews, since he is a time traveler from the 29th century. And well, that pretty much is the main timeline. More games offer more detailed information than others. Some pilots' interviews or pilot profiles add a little bit more, but that's about it. There may be some small details I missed, but I think I got all the major events of that timeline. Now I'll quickly go over the anime timeline. It pretty much explains itself if you watch the entire anime, so if you haven't done that, what are you doing? Go watch it. It's alright. I don't want this to be just a summary of every anime episode, since that's boring, and also this video would be like 2 hours long if I did that. I will just summarize the major events in chronological order. Anime spoilers if that isn't obvious, by the way. The earliest point in the anime timeline is 2051. Pretty much the beginning of the anime. During that time, Ryo Suzaku was an F1 racer and a cop. At one point, he chased Soda, who just escaped prison, and that resulted in an accident which put Ryo in cold sleep for many years. 50 years later, in 2101, Earth made its first contact with an alien planet. Soon after, more planets and species followed, and at the time of the anime's story, about 30% of Earth's population is made up of alien species. The year 2132 is mentioned in episode 14 in the flashback of Silver Nielsen. It shows him training for an upcoming race, but during said training he had an accident. His friend Anthony also had an accident in the race, which Silver didn't participate in. 2196 is kind of an important year for this timeline, in that year Black Shadow broke into Alcatraz to revive Zola and most likely Miss Killer as well, to begin his grand plan. Also in 2196, a transport ship on Hero exploded. It involved Dark Million, Soda, Roy Hughes, who then becomes the enemy version of Mighty Gazelle, and Captain Falcon. 2 years after that, in 2198, Jodie Summer lost her brother in a shootout between the police and Soda. Jodie was severely injured, but she was rebuilt as a cyborg by Dr. Stewart, while her brother Andy was considered to be dead. It is later confirmed that Andy is Captain Falcon, who is very much alive. Pretty much the entire anime happens from 2201 to 2202. I'm not going to summarize every episode now, I'm not crazy. 2101 is the year when Ryu woke up from cold sleep. After his disbelief, he joined the Elite Mobile Task Force and becomes the protagonist of this story. Later on, Lucy Liberty and Clank Hughes also join. A few major events that happen during this time are Soda turning off the shields on Meteor's gym and destroying parts of the track, cancelling the race's result. Pico's multiple failed assassination attempts on Sean Tanaka, the warp gate malfunction, the surprise visit from Takura, the creation of Mighty Gazelle, the introduction of Blood Falcon, Jack Levin briefly returning to his past as a gang member, Captain Falcon and Blood Falcon disappearing, the Elite Mobile Task Force ceasing operation for a short period of time, Black Shadow revealing his big plan, Captain Falcon returning, the Dragon Bird being upgraded with a second reactor might, Black Shadow starting the Dark Reactor, which causes many disasters in the galaxy, the destruction of said Dark Reactor, and the death of Black Shadow and Andy Summer, with the last big event being the birth of a new Captain Falcon, which is Ryu. That should sum it up. There is so much more that happens in all the episodes, but most things are just mentioned in one episode and never again. These events I've talked about all kinda have an impact or are somewhat interesting to me at least. In the last episode we get a short glimpse into the year 2207. Ryo is now the new Captain Falcon, he rebuilt the Blue Falcon as well. Clank is now an adult and races in the Dragonbird, which has been restored to its original version for some reason. Clank's father Roy has also returned and he looks like he did before he was a cyborg, probably advancement in technology or something. And well, a new GP starts and that's where the animated timeline ends. Okay, this has been the most important info about the anime, but where are the games? That's a good question. It's difficult. GP Legend has a story mode, but that's where the problem is. It simply doesn't add up. Nothing that happens in the game happens in the anime. Maybe they didn't want to spoil anything, but what do I know? The anime timeline is already not canon anyway, so consider the GP Legend story even less canon, if that makes sense. Climax has no story or lore. It has this, but it's just summaries of each anime episode. Nothing more. We get Aeropolis again, but they mirror lore that we already know if you watch the anime. Yeah, that's not a very satisfying ending, I know. That's just how it is sometimes. Well, that was quite a lot. Both timelines explained in a reasonable amount of time. I originally wanted to split this video into 2 parts, but I scrapped that idea and here we are now. I hope you learned something or at least enjoyed it. I certainly did. I knew a lot before, but I also learned so much researching all the information and rewatching most of the anime just for this video. It was fun. Anyway, I won't keep you here any longer. Watch the shorts if you haven't already, and I'll see you all again next month or whenever my next short is uploaded. Have a good one. Bye.